This is the history of now. Let's start this one out by talking about bras. One of the largest manufacturers of bras in the world is Topform International Limited. Founded in 1963 in Hong Kong, where it is still headquartered today, this is a multinational corporation that supplies underwear and intimate apparel to name brands, selling upwards of 61 million bras every year. Topform's main market is the United States, where it is a chief supplier to labels like Calvin Klein and Maidenform. Although based in Hong Kong, Topform is 23% owned by Belgian luxury lingerie maker Van de Velde (NV), which supplies outlets like Victoria's Secret and Walmart. This is Willy Fung. He's the chairman of Topform International. Under his watch, the company has been doubling and tripling its market value every year since 2010. This has to do with its strength in the American market, but also in Europe and increasingly China. Over the past decade, the market in China for underwear and nightwear, much like the market for almost everything else, has been exploding. But even more significant than the market for Willy Fung is the labor. Although the United States remains the company's number one customer, China is its number one producer, making 60% of the products that Topform sells. Another 33% of its underwear is manufactured in Thailand, with the rest in Cambodia and Myanmar. Given these statistics, an international executive like Willy Fung is supremely focused on economic and trade developments in all of Asia. That's why he has been paying special attention to the international negotiations now taking place over the formation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, is a proposed trade agreement that would include a number of countries in the Pacific Rim. The goals of the TPP are to lower trade barriers between participating nations and establish common laws for copyright, labor, and the environment that would supersede the economic rules of the individual states, including a mechanism for resolving legal disputes between business investors and sovereign governments. And on this map right here, you can see color-coded in dark green. Those are the principal members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership already. Lighter green in Asia right there are countries that are in negotiations to join. And then you see China and India are what the people putting together the TPP hope to be future participating nations. According to the White House's Office of United States Trade Representative website, the TPP is envisioned to make it easier to sell made in America goods and services exports to some of the most dynamic and fastest growing markets in the world and support homegrown jobs and economic growth. If and when adopted, the TPP would become the latest and largest in a series of free trade agreements that the United States has entered into, beginning with the free trade agreement signed with Israel in 1996 and followed soon thereafter by the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. These agreements are some of the most striking examples of the institutionalization of a massive process of breaking down the economic and political barriers between nations that has come to be called globalization. Now, back to Willy Fung. A recent New York Times article wrote about what Fung plans to do should the U.S. and the 11 Pacific Rim nations complete the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement this summer. Quote, he will catch a flight to Vietnam to look at possible locations for a new brassiere factory. This is because none of the countries that manufacture Topform products, China, Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar, are part of the planned trade agreement so far, and this makes Fung worry that his company will become less competitive if Vietnam qualifies for extra low tariffs and the United States eases access in other ways to its vast market. So the current negotiations over the TPP highlight the enormous implications that global trade has for every aspect of life in the modern world. Just as with the creation of NAFTA in the 1990s and other huge global trade agreements, the TPP has generated intense controversy within the United States and abroad. Critics like the consumer advocacy group Global Trade Watch and others have blasted the high level of secrecy surrounding the negotiations. Others have argued that free trade agreements have a negative impact on American workers in particular. For example, California Congresswoman Barbara Lee opposes the TPP, she says, because she opposes, quote, bad trade deals that hurt American workers, American families, and American businesses, especially in communities of color. And she points to NAFTA and other deals with China, claiming that they have cost 3.4 million American jobs, 33% of them going to China. The TPP and the controversy surrounding it spotlight a central feature of U.S. foreign policy, one that is almost something of a paradox. That is, the role that the principle of free trade plays in American diplomacy, and the tension between the priorities of global capitalism and national or domestic welfare. Historically speaking, this tension has been built into the United States' relationship with the Pacific Rim nations, especially China, from almost the very beginning. Now, international trade was a core feature of the American economy even before the United States was created. As colonies of the vast and powerful British Empire, British North America prospered in the 18th century because of its role in supplying raw commodities and cash crops to the British Isles and other nations of Europe. In return, the colonies were furnished with consumer goods, like teapots and clothing manufactured in the empire's metropolitan centers in England. In fact, most of the notable controversies that sparked the American Revolution were rooted in issues related to import duties and other aspects of imperial trade. Now, once established as an independent nation, the United States' earliest declaration of foreign policy principles were articulated in terms of trade. George Washington, in his famous farewell address as President of the United States in 1796, famously laid down his great rule of conduct when it came to foreign relations, which was to have as little political connection as possible with foreign powers, while simultaneously extending our commercial relations with them. This policy, to a greater or lesser extent, guided U.S. overseas policy for most of the 19th century. And it was enhanced and expanded in 1823 by the Monroe Doctrine, which declared the American foreign policy principles of non-colonization and non-intervention. That is, President Monroe proclaimed that the Western Hemisphere was henceforth off limits to further colonization by European powers, essentially making it within the United States' sphere of influence. And at the same time, the United States pledged not to interfere in the European colonies of Central and South America that already existed. Of course, at the end of the 19th century, the United States did intervene in the politics of Central America when it declared war in 1898 on the decaying remains of the Spanish Empire during the Cuban War for Independence. As a consequence of the Spanish-American War, the United States acquired a number of former Spanish possessions, including Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, in effect becoming an overseas empire. Control of the Philippines, in particular, reflected and enhanced the United States' interest in the Pacific Rim. The Atlantic Ocean, with its core markets in Europe, remained the center of American international trade and diplomacy. But even before 1898, the United States had been expanding into the Pacific, taking possession of a number of small islands across the vast ocean for naval stations and other purposes. And American missionaries, settlers, and businessmen had been locked in a battle with the indigenous monarchy of Hawaii for control of its land and resources. Indeed, Hawaii officially came into U.S. possession that same year as the Spanish-American War, 1898. So by the turn of the century, the United States was increasingly looking west in terms of its foreign policy, international trade, and its own geopolitical zone of influence. And this brings us to China. From a purely economic perspective, China has represented a vast and lucrative market. Its enormous population, landmass, and resources make business-minded people see dollar signs, and Americans have had business in mind when it came to China almost from the start. However, at the end of the 19th century, international politics was all about old-school imperial politics. After its devastating defeat in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895, China faced imminent danger of being partitioned and colonized by imperialist European powers such as Britain, France, Russia, and also Germany, and in Asia, Japan. After winning the Spanish-American War of 1898, with the newly acquired colony of the Philippine Islands, the United States' presence in Asia expanded, and Americans were looking to develop their commercial and political interests in China. The fear was, if China was cut up and partitioned into European and Japanese spheres of influence, the United States would lose access to the potentially lucrative Chinese market. So, in September 1899, Secretary of State John Hay delivered his open door notes to the key powers in the situation, excluding China. We're talking about France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Japan, and Russia. Got these notes from Secretary of State John Hay. These notes asked the powers to agree formally to a number of principles. Number one being maintain China's territorial sovereignty and integrity. That is, don't carve it up into separate zones, that China remain whole. To allow free use of all treaty ports in China for all nations who want to use them for trade. That is, to agree not to establish imperial spheres of influence and preference. The bottom line of the open door policy was that all nations could enjoy equal access to China's markets. Now, the open door policy was only grudgingly accepted by the imperial powers, but it became a central feature of the conduct of U.S. foreign policy, wedding economic interests to the power of American diplomacy. In the specific case of China, the open door policy governed U.S. foreign relations until 1949, when the Communist Revolution, led by Mao Zedong, led to the founding of the People's Republic of China. For the subsequent nearly 25 years, the United States and China were not on speaking terms. Indeed, the United States refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of Communist China and instead operated under the diplomatic fiction that the island of Taiwan was the official Chinese state. Then something interesting happened. In 1972, President Richard Nixon shocked the world by suddenly announcing his intention to go to China and meet with Mao to ease Cold War tensions. The so-called opening of China was a historic turning point in U.S.-China relations. Then, 6 years later, when Deng Xiaoping took office, he announced a new policy of openness to foreign business that wanted to invest in China that some have called the second open door policy. This began the long process of the economic transformation of modern China that has been accelerating over the past several decades. Ever since then, and up till today, it is common to see American politicians and commentators alike talking about the rise of China. Historically speaking, Americans have been using this same phrase for more than a century, and this link in the historical imagination between power, Asian geopolitics, and trade has long been central to thinking about China inside the United States. Always in these discussions, there seems to be a tension that borders on confusion regarding the relationship between global, free trade, laissez-faire capitalism and the more insular concerns of national job security. In principle, massive trade agreements like the TPP are expressions of the free market in action, liberated from more and more barriers to the movement of capital, goods, and services, labor, and resources. The open door policy reflects the centrality of capitalism in U.S. foreign relations. On the other hand, critics argue that what free trade allows for is the flight of manufacturing outside the United States to countries where labor and facilities are more cost effective. That, they say, not only perpetuates labor exploitation, but erodes job opportunities inside the United States. So, in terms of the history of now, here's a question for you. Can the United States promote global free market capitalism in its foreign policy while simultaneously insulating American workers and consumers from labor dislocation? And you'll see a forum and a topic on the discussion boards to get into this question if you're interested. Okay, so that was the history of now on the theme of US and the world. But think about that theme right there. It's pretty huge. Especially since World War II, everything about U.S. history has been profoundly shaped by its central place in global affairs. So now, are you interested in grabbing yourself up to 40 points for participation? Of course you are. If so, spend a little time. Read the news for recent events involving U.S. foreign policy. Find yourself a good story on U.S. interaction with the world and do a little research into the history behind the story. Write a 1 to 2 page analysis, including comments and questions on the historical background of the issue or event. And then upload that little paper to Dropbox by Friday, July 24th, and get up to 40 points, okay? There's a ton of possibilities given the United States' place in the world. Here's just a few ideas of big themes to look for. U.S. military operations, immigration, environmental affairs, nuclear proliferation, human rights. So go out there, check the news out, write a little paper, get some points, have a ball.